In the bustling streets of Egbe, where survival was a game of wit, one name stood above all others: Adeswa, the food seller whose meal could make even the stingiest man spend money. Her restaurant wasn't just a place to eat, it was an experience, a battlefield where the rich and the poor fought for a spot in line. Adeswa's food was nothing like anyone had ever tasted. It was so good, people from nearby towns would abandon their own food sellers, leaving their wives and mothers with empty kitchens just to taste a spoon of Adeswa's pepper stew. The scene at a restaurant was always chaotic. Rich men dressed in fine agbada, their heavy gold chains glittering in the sun, would park their shining SUVs down the street because the restaurant had no parking space left. They would trek, sweating under the sun, but none of them cared. The line were long and the rules were simple: wash your own plates or no food. Even the richest customer had no choice but to roll up their sleeves and scrub. The sight of alhajis, chief, and big businessmen washing plates like boys in the village added to the madness of the place. And the craziest part, nobody complained. One Memorial Day, Chief Dele, a man with enough money to build 10 restaurants, swaggered into Mama T's food, Adeswa's kitchen, with his young side chick. The girl was slim, light-skinned, and wearing a gown so tight it looked like she had been poured into it. Chief Dele, feeling on top of the world, sat with her, not knowing his trouble had already arrived. His wife, Madam Bosse, the no-nonsense woman with the body of a wrestler, was already sitting in the corner, a wrapper tied so tightly it seemed ready to snap. The moment Madam Bosse saw her husband feeding another woman, the air in the restaurant froze. She stood up slowly, her eyes narrowing as she approached their table. "Dele, so this is what you have been doing with our money, Abi?" Her voice thundered across the room. Chief Dele jumped up, stuttering, but Madam Bosse wasn't listening. She grabbed a tray of hot egusi soup from a nearby table, and before anyone could stop her, she flung it at Chief Dele. But the aim wasn't good. The soup landed on the floor, splashing on some unlucky customers. The crowd erupted in chaos. "Ah, our egusi don't waste," someone screamed. The side chick ran out, almost slipping in the soup, while Dele tried to calm his wife down. The staff had seen enough. They bundled Madam Bosse and Chief Dele out, their faces red with embarrassment. The two swore never to return, but the very next day, there they were again, acting like nothing happened. Such was the power of Adeswa's food. Adeswa herself, she sat in her usual corner, watching the drama unfold with a smile that sent chills down people's spines. She was a big woman, dark, with chubby cheeks that looked like they could burst at any moment. But there was something about her presence that made men fear her. She hardly spoke, but when she did, even the toughest of men shook in their boots. Her staff weren't any better. They treated customers like they were doing them a favor. They shouted at people who asked too much questions and pushed aside anyone who was too slow to order. And God help you if you try to complain about anything. But no matter how rude the staff were, the customers always came back. Why? Because Adeswa's food was like a fever. Once it caught you, there was no escape. For some, the fever was even worse. Pregnant women especially were addicted to Adeswa's. They would waddle into the restaurants, their big bellies leading the way, their faces full of desperation. Many had been up all night, unable to sleep, because the only thing they could think of was Adeswa's pepper stew. Some would cry real tears if the line was too long, pleading with the staff to serve them first. because their cravings were unbearable. And once they got a taste of that peppery goodness, they would sigh in relief, as if the sickness had been taken away from them. Wives who had long given up cooking would send their husbands to buy Adesuwa's food, threatening them with a cold bed if they came back empty-handed. The husbands, knowing better, would stand in line for hours, sweating like Christmas goats, because the taste of Adesuwa's food was worth it. But it wasn't all glory. The other food vendors in town weren't happy. One by one, their businesses collapsed as all their customers flocked to Madam T Foods. Some tried to imitate Adesuwa's cooking, but it was useless. The taste was never the same. Others, out of desperation, sued her, accusing her of using juju to attract customers. They said there was no way her food could be that good without some dark magic behind it. They took her to court, but as soon as the judges tasted her food, the cases were thrown out. Even the law couldn't resist her cooking. What they didn't know was that Adesuwa's success wasn't ordinary. There was a secret behind her rise, a dark and dangerous one no one could have imagined. And when the truth would finally come out, it will shake the town of Egbe to its very foundation. Adesuwa's story started many years ago. A young Adesuwa had just been a 12-year-old orphan taken in by Madam Titi, a local food seller. Her life was far from a fairy tale. While Madam Titi's own children lay in bed till noon, Adesuwa toiled from dawn. She blended tomato, started the fires, and ran market errands, all while Madam Titi lounged in her favorite chair, surveying her empire. Adesuwa was the true backbone of her food business, though her efforts went unacknowledged. The worst part was that, despite her diligence, Madam Titi never let her attend school. But Adesuwa didn't complain. She was just grateful to have a roof over her head. As she blossomed into a beautiful young woman, her life took a dark turn. Uncle Dede, Madam Titi's husband, had been watching her for years, and one night, he began sneaking into her room. His touches started off as inappropriate brushes, but soon evolved into something much more sinister. When Adesuwa confided in Madam Titi, hoping for protection, she was met with violence. "Shut up, you evil witch! Do you want to destroy my marriage?" Madam Titi's slap rang in Adesuwa's ear long after the blow landed. That night, Uncle Dede returned to Adesuwa's room. "See yourself now. Instead of you to keep quiet and be a big girl, you wait to run your mouth. No one can save you here," he whispered menacingly. Adesuwa cried into her pillow that night, cursing her fate. But her silent screams were never answered. Uncle Dede's assault continued for years. When she turned 18, her body betrayed her with a pregnancy. Terrified, she approached Madam Titi, praying for some understanding. But her revelation was met with even more fury. "So, you have been sleeping with all those small boys from my restaurant, eh?" Madam Titi's voice dripped with venom. Adesuwa shook her head, her tears falling freely. "It's your husband," Adesuwa whispered. The slap came down even harder this time. "You seduced my husband, didn't you? Get out of my house." Madam Titi barked. Adesuwa's belongings were thrown out, and she was left standing in the pouring rain, clutching her stomach and her polythene bag. She cried until she had no more tears left. The world has turned its back on her. But as the storm passed, something inside Adesuwa stirred. I have been running Madam Titi's business since I was a child. I know this trade. I would survive, she thought to herself. With nothing but the clothes on her hands, Adesua left Egbe, determined to forge her own path. Adesua arrived in Oka, a new town with nothing but hope and determination. She managed to secure a job as a cook at a local restaurant. Her culinary skills were unmatched, and soon her boss took notice. He offered her a small room in the back of the restaurant as accommodation. For the first time in a long while, Adesua felt a glimmer of security, but it didn't last long. Rumors spread like wildfire. People whispered that Adesua was sleeping with her boss and that the child she carried was his. It wasn't long before his jealous wife stormed the restaurant one afternoon, her face twisted with anger. "Get out of here, you home wrecker," she shouted, dragging Adesua out by her arm. Her boss stood by, his eyes filled with sadness, but too weak to defy his wife. Once again, Adesua found herself homeless and pregnant, wandering the streets with nowhere to turn. She slept on a cold corridor that night, only to be woken up by the voice of Mr. Sam, a notorious money lender known for his ruthless tactics. "What are you doing here, girl?" he asked. Adesua hesitated, but eventually told him her story. Mr. Sam listened with a calculating smile. "I can help you," he said, his eyes gleaming, "but it will cost you." Adesua, desperate, agreed to his terms, and with the loan he gave her, she started her own humble food business. She worked tirelessly despite being 8 months pregnant. With every plate she served, she got closer to paying off her debt. But her body was weary. The weight of her pregnancy grew heavier by the day. One afternoon, as she worked in a tiny food store, the pain hit her hard. She staggered to the midwife's house where she had planned to give birth. But it was a difficult labor, and Adesua feared she wouldn't make it through. The midwife worked tirelessly, but the hours dragged on, and Adesua's strength began to fade. Would her dream for a better life end before it even began? Adesua had been in labor for 3 grueling days, her body weak and bleeding. The midwife, panicking, called for help. A vehicle rushed her to the hospital, where furious nurses asked why she hadn't come earlier. Too exhausted, Adesua shook her head when asked if she had done any antenatal care. The doctor informed the midwife that brought Adesua in that an emergency operation was needed to save both mother and babies. Hours later, the doctor emerged with good news. Adesua was safe and she had delivered twin boys, but mother and sons needed intensive care. Adesua's joy was overshadowed by the hospital bills. Wiping out her savings, she begged loyal customers for loan, but her biggest worry was Mr. Sam, the money lender, whom she had previously borrowed money from. Once discharged, she returned home, only to find out that her sales girl had sold everything in her food store and disappeared with the money. The weight of it all made her collapse in tears. Weeks passed, and Adesua barely survived on small donations from the midwife and a few good customers who took pity on her. Mr. Sam, growing impatient, sent talk to destroy her 1-bedroom, warning her to pay up her debt. Desperate, Adesua dialed Uncle Dede, the man who had abused her and gotten her pregnant. But his cruel rejection and insult crushed her. She cried herself to sleep, wondering how she would survive with her twins. Consumed by despair, Adesua decided to take her twins to the market and beg. Early the next morning, she dressed them in tattered clothes and found a spot under a shed. She sang softly, shaking a tambourine to attract attention. Market women took pity on her, asking about the children's father. "He is dead," she replied. Moved, they gave her money, food, and even clothes. That night, for the first time in a while, Adesua smiled. Her begging continued daily, and slowly, she managed to pay a small amount to Mr. Sam, the money lender. For once, she felt hope return. One day, a black sleek SUV pulled up in front of her while she was begging at the market. Her heart raced as a woman dressed in expensive clothes and sunglasses stepped out. It was Madam Toke, a powerful businesswoman. Adesua hurried to kneel before Madam Toke, greeting her humbly. Madam Toke, observing her, handed Adesua cash and a business card. "Come see me at home," she said. "I can change your life if you are ready for what it takes." Overwhelmed by the gesture, Adesua thanked her profusely. "Thank you, ma. Thank you, ma. Thank you, ma." That night, she danced in her room, believing her life was about to change. When the day arrived, Adesua dressed herself and her twins in their best clothes. They headed to Madam Toke's mansion, stunned by the sheer size of the place. The lavish interior left Adesua in awe, everything screaming wealth. Madam Toke welcomed her, offering food and drink, and she said, "I won't ask about your past. I'm here to show you how to turn your life around," she said, revealing that she had once been poor and was abandoned by her husband. But an encounter changed her life overnight. There is a small sacrifice, but nothing in life is free, Madam Toke explained, her eyes gleaming. Adesua, desperate, agreed immediately, not asking about the cost. Madam Toke smiled, telling her to return in 7 days, promising to teach her how to succeed. The 7th day arrived. Adesua dressed in her best clothes and set out for Madam Toke's house, leaving her children with the kind midwife. Her heart pounded, but she had made up her mind. This was her chance at a better life. Madam Toke, always composed, greeted her with a smile as they both set out. They drove past familiar streets in the remote parts of Oka, deeper and deeper into unfamiliar territory. Adesuwa's nerves began to unravel as they ventured into the wilderness. Finally, Madam Toke pulled her SUV at a stop at the edge of the dense forest. She stepped out of the car and gestured for Adesuwa to follow. With every step, Adesuwa's fear grew. She thought about turning back, but the promise of a better future for her and her children kept her moving forward. They trekked deeper into the forest, the thick canopy above dimming the light. After what felt like hours, they arrived at a small hilly hut. Inside, the air was suffocating. The room was draped in red cloth, filled with graven images, amulets, and clay pots. But what truly sent shivers down Adesuwa's spine was the ancient-looking woman sitting in the middle of the room, bald, wrinkled, with white eyes and black lips. She was a nightmarish sight. Her crooked teeth added to her terrifying aura as she sat on a wooden stool covered with red cloth, wearing a white gown adorned with more amulets. Adesuwa's legs trembled, and she instinctively hid behind Madam Toke. Sensing her fear, Madam Toke reassured her, "Don't be afraid. This is the leader of Olowo women cult. All the big women you see, politicians' wives, big business women, they all come here for wealth and power." Adesuwa's mouth dropped open in shock. She had never imagined anything more sinister than this. Madam Toke's word echoed in her mind. She didn't want to become part of something this dark. She had only wanted a small business to feed her children, not to join a secret cult. Panic surged through her as she stammered, "I can't do this. I don't want to be rich like this." Just as she turned to leave, the old woman's voice thundered through the air. "Adesua, stop right there, or you will run mad for the rest of your life." Adesua stood in terror. The ancient woman continued, "I know everything about you, from before you were born. I see your past, present, and future. That is why I sent for you. But since you wish to leave, I cannot let you go. You know too much." Her voice dripped with menace. "I will give you 3 options. 1, you will die in 7 days. 2, you will run mad for the rest of your miserable life. Or 3, you will join us and become rich and powerful. Choose wisely." Adesua collapsed on her knees, sobbing. The first 2 options were unthinkable. She had 2 children who needed her. After what felt like an eternity, she looked up and whispered, "I will join." The ancient woman smiled wickedly. "Very good. Step forward." Adesua shuffled forward, her heart hammering. The old woman handed her a calabash filled with a dark liquid. "Drink." Adesua's hands trembled as she raised the calabash to her lips. The vile liquid sliding down her throat. She gagged but managed to keep it down. The old woman cackled, "You are now one of us. Wealth and power will be yours. But remember, nothing comes for free. Pay your dues or you will run mad, and your empire will crumble." The old woman handed Adesua a bundle of cash. "This is your capital. Open a restaurant. Your food will be irresistible. Big men and women will flock to you, but you must follow the rules. Every meal you cook must contain certain ingredients." Adesua's stomach turned. "What ingredients?" she asked. "Used sanitary pads, pubic hairs of young girls, and this potion," the woman said, handing her a small vial. "Every morning, perform the rituals in a secret room where no one can see you. Add the mixture to your food and success will be yours." Adesua's hand shook as she took the money and the vial. Her head was spinning. She was in too deep now. Madame Toke smiled approvingly, and together they left the forest. Months later, Adesua opened a restaurant, Mama T Foods, in honor of her twin boys. Business boomed. Customers couldn't get enough of her meals, and Adesua became the talk of the town. The once poor food seller was now a wealthy businesswoman. Her restaurant always packed with people from all walks of life. She hired workers to assist with cleaning, serving, and other tasks, but she did all the cooking herself. Every morning, she would wake up before dawn, enter her secret room, and perform the dark rituals, mixing the forbidden ingredients into her food. Her staff never questioned why the meals were always ready before they arrived. Soon, her success outgrew her modest location. She bought the land from Madame Titi, the woman who had once thrown her out in Egbe, and built a new grander restaurant. She hired more workers, but only she knew the secret behind her irresistible food. Adesua had a team of secret workers who collected used sanitary pads and shaving sticks from hotels and boarding schools. They were on her payroll, but had no idea why she needed such items. Years passed and Adesua's wealth grew. She became a top member of the Olowo women cult, always paying her dues on time. Her twin boys, now in one of the most prestigious schools in the country, were her pride and joy. Adesua remained unmarried, afraid to let anyone close enough to discover her dark secrets. One day, during a court meeting deep in the forest, the ancient leader called for this year's dues. When it was Adesua's turn, the leader's cold voice sent chills down her spine. "This year, your sacrifice will be your twin boys." Adesua gasped, her heart shattering. "No, not my voice. They are all I have in this world." The ancient woman sneered, "You have enjoyed our wealth and power for years. Now it's time to pay. Either you sacrifice your boys or you run mad. Choose." Adesua fell on her knees, tears streaming down her face. She pleaded with the ancient woman, but her pleas fell on a deaf ear. The woman's decision was final. Devastated, Adesua returned home. That night, she couldn't sleep. The faces of her beautiful sons haunted her. She had enjoyed wealth and power, but her children meant more to her than anything. She made up her mind she would sacrifice herself to save them. Days later, Adesua arrived at her restaurant, burdened by the knowledge that she would soon go mad. She had written a will instructing her lawyer to take care of her sons when she was gone. The weight of her decision crushed her spirit, but she had made peace with her fate. That afternoon, the sky over Egba darkened. A storm like no other hit the town. Thunder roared and lightning struck. The people inside Madam T food were terrified as lightning repeatedly struck the building. Suddenly, part of the restaurant collapsed, revealing Adesua's secret room filled with used sanitary pad, pubic hair, and other fetish items. The crowd was horrified. "She's a ritualist," someone shouted. Panic ensued. People began vomiting, disgusted at the thought of what they had eaten. Chaos erupted, and an angry mob stormed the restaurant, dragging Adesua outside. They threw stones at her and cursed her, calling her a witch and a devil. Some wanted to kill her on the spot, while others insisted that she was to be taken to the king's palace for judgment. At the king's palace, Adesua knelt before the furious king. He had been one of her loyal customers, ordering food every day. Now, he was disgusted by her betrayal. "Confess," he roared. Adesua, broken and defeated, confessed everything. She told them about the cult, the rituals, and how she had used young women's destiny and wombs to enrich herself. The crowd gasped at every revelation, horrified by the depth of her evil. The king, filled with rage, cursed her, ordering her restaurant and wealth to be seized. As the police dragged her out of the palace, lightning struck Adesua's chest. She fell to the ground, laughing uncontrollably. The crowd watched in horror as she descended into madness, running into the streets, shouting, "Don't touch my children! Don't touch my children!" And so, the once powerful Adesua became a mad woman wandering the streets of Egbe, her empire in ruin, her soul lost to darkness.